An interesting development in the 1990s is that beginning in 1992, the individuals appointed by the SEC chair to become chief accountant increasingly, almost totally, were partners of the big audit firms who typically came for 2 to 3 year periods. Remember we said from 1935 until 1972, there were 4 successive chief accountants who had missions developed in the 1930s, who were civil servants. And then we had mostly a civil servant in the interim, a couple of civil servants mostly, in addition to Sandy Burton in the early part of the 1970s. But by 1992, the practice had begun of appointing a partner, a top technical partner usually, in one of the big audit firms to become chief accountant, either shortly before their retirement or after their retirement. They might go right back to the same firm. They would stay no longer than 2 or 3 years. And so therefore the character of the chief accountant changed. There was a much greater turnover. Everybody knew they would be there for a short period of time. And also one has to take into account that the accounting profession had changed very much in the 1980s. Previous to the 1980s, there were quite a number of intellectual leaders of the profession who wrote articles, who gave speeches on what they thought proper accounting ought to be. They even wrote books in some cases. They were very much concerned about shaping the future of financial reporting. But by the 1980s, starting in the 1970s, quite a number, virtually all, of the big audit firms had become more commercial enterprises than professional enterprises, more concerned about profitability and growth than they were about serving clients, at the time at which clients were becoming more insistent about what they wanted to see from the standard setter and the auditor. And so as a result, the people who were intellectual leaders of the profession had either retired or left the profession. And the accounting firms, the audit firms, didn't promote through the ranks people who would likely be intellectual leaders. They were interested in simply ticking the boxes necessary to satisfy GAAP with respect to clients. One partner in a major audit firm in the 1980s was heard to say that the worst thing that a partner can do is to lose a client over a matter of principle. That is to say, writing an article arguing against using a particular accounting principle that one of the firm's clients wants very much to use and does not want to have as an audit firm one that has a partner who would write such an article. By the 1990s, there were virtually no articles being written by audit firm partners anymore on what could be improvements in financial reporting. Well, by the 1990s, we're talking now about people coming from the upper ranks of the firms to become SEC chief accountant. And what I'm suggesting is very few of them had any ideology about what was sound accounting at the time they came to the SEC. Consequently, you didn't have chief accountants like you had in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s with an ideology and the strength of principle and the backbone to use their power to enforce those ideas. That didn't happen beginning in the 90s, except in a few rare cases for only a few issues. So the chief accountants were there for a 2 or 3 year period, but they didn't have the kind of impact at all that previous chief accountants had. This change in character is important to note. Now getting back to some of the interesting episodes. 1997-98, the banking community again came to the fore, tried to prevent the FASB from issuing a standard on derivative securities, and hedging, which had become more and more an issue since the 1980s. An interesting passage was written by the chief financial correspondent of the New York Times. We quote, "The campaign is on to kill the FASB. The banks are furious over the new derivatives rule, which would force users of derivatives to record the market value of those instruments in their financial reports. The banks say the rule will confuse investors and scare off some companies that would benefit from using derivatives. They have lobbied hard in Congress, and both the House and the Senate have held hearings to bash the FASB on the issue. End of quote. And this is a good way of characterizing what went on. Again, the FASB was buffeted by criticism and powerful lobbying by the banks, but this time they succeeded. In 1998, the board succeeded in issuing the standard, but once again, they were up against powerful lobbying, and the banks always present that. Finally, in the late 1990s, the FASB got rid of pooling of interest accounting for business combinations and ended mandatory amortization of goodwill, which you may recall had started in 1970 with the 40-year life. This had been a concern, of course, going back decades. And finally, with the support of the SEC, and as a matter of fact, the issue was placed on the FASB's agenda in 1996 because the SEC chief accountant wanted it to be on the agenda. He said a significant fraction of our time in the office of the chief accountant is taken talking to companies about whether prospective business combinations qualify for pooling of interest or not. And they wanted to get rid of pooling of interest accounting. The 1990s was a decade of a great deal of merger and acquisition activity. And so the FASB put it on its agenda, deliberated the matter, and recommended finally that pooling of interest accounting be eliminated. And there was apparently no view from Congress opposing it, although industry didn't like it. But apparently industry finally realized they weren't going to get this changed. The more important issue was, what are you going to do about goodwill? Because, of course, if you use the purchase method, all of a sudden goodwill becomes a big issue. It wasn't such a big issue in 1970 because if almost all of the business combinations were going to be pooling of interest, no goodwill would be shown. It would be shown only when you use the purchase method. And now it looks like the purchase method will be the one that you have to use. Well, the FASB was proposing the mandatory amortization of goodwill down from 40 years to 20 years, a maximum of 5% a year. Industry didn't like it. They passed this message on to members of Congress. The chairman of the Banking Committee in the Senate held a hearing, and at that hearing, where the chairman of the FASB was there discussing pooling of interest and goodwill, he said, haven't you considered as an option to mandatory amortization the possibility of mandatory annual impairment testing? Obviously given to him by people in industry who would well prefer the subjectivity and the flexibility of impairment testing as opposed to the formula of annual amortization that was imposed by whatever useful life you chose. Well, the FASB hadn't thought about impairment seriously. The chairman went back, they discussed it, did some field testing, and decided as a matter of principle they could support mandatory amortization instead of mandatory impairment testing instead of mandatory amortization. They rushed out an exposure draft calling for this change, that there would no longer be amortization of goodwill allowed, and instead there would be mandatory impairment testing of goodwill. It went through, and it was finally approved and issued in June of 2001. Pooling was dead. Mandatory amortization of goodwill was dead, but mandatory impairment testing of goodwill was alive and kicking. And here was a case where, again, industry drove the change with respect to goodwill, but it was one that the FASB felt it could approve in principle. In the late 1990s, the FASB, as I say, finally got rid of pooling. Oh, we discussed that, and I said that didn't come to the end of it. This dropping of mandatory amortization of goodwill was prompted by the chair of the U.S. Senate Banking Committee, that was Phil Gramm, by the way, likely at the behest of industry, which did not like to see an automatic annual reduction in net income via amortization. Now, in 2002, Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the wake of the Enron and WorldCom accounting and auditing scandals. Among other things, the act instructed the SEC to designate an accounting standard setter, which would be funded by an annual accounting support fee to be levied by the SEC on the issuers of securities. This was the first time that a U.S. accounting standard setter was financed by a government-imposed levy and not just by voluntary contributions from the private sector. Of course, that was the original model. When the FASB was set up, the FAF trustees had to go hat in hand to corporations and audit firms to get funding to support the entire FAF-FASB organization. But it happened from time to time that when certain companies did not like a standard, they would threaten no longer to donate to the organization. And there was a concern that this lowered the degree of independence that the standard setter had if it had to depend so heavily on contributions from industry. Of course, another support were from the sales of its publications. And so the annual support fee was set up, which meant every year the SEC meets with the FASB, looks over the FASB's budget, and then decides on the amount of the annual accounting support fee, which is then levied by the SEC on issuers of securities. What this probably has done, as we'll see it in a little bit later, is it's caused the SEC to realize it has even more of a stake in the work of the FASB, because now it has to provide the funds, not from its own budget, but from companies decided by the SEC every year that will support the FAF and the FASB. In 2003, the SEC announced its designation of the FASB as that standard setter and said that the FASB will continue its role as the preeminent accounting standard setter in the private sector. Well, that surprised nobody. But the next statement did was a surprise. At the same time, and in the same announcement, the SEC made it clear to the FAF and the FASB that the Commission's views are to be solicited on the future selection of FAF trustees and FAF-FASB members, and that, in quotes, the FAF should consider those views in making its final selection, end of quotes, making it quite clear that in addition to providing the annual accounting support fee in a levy against issuers of securities, the SEC expected to be consulted when new members of the trustees and the board are being considered, and that the FAF should consider those views in making its final selection. A fairly strong statement. Another stake that the SEC has in the running of the FASB. Here we come to a period in which it is more a collaborative activity, where the SEC almost seems to be a part of the standard-setting activity, as opposed to the earlier decades when it was more of a conflict, especially when the standard setter was a part-time body and was overseen by the chief accountants who had a sense of mission beginning in the 1930s. It's interesting how the landscape has changed in the relationship between the SEC's chief accountant and the standard setter, and it has changed significantly. In 2004, after tumultuous intrusions from industry and Congress, the FASB succeeded finally in issuing a standard on employee stock options, remember the 1990s, which required the expensing of their cost in the income statement. Much of the early motive power behind its success came from the FIASB's push to do the same with its own IFRS 2 on share-based payment. So just after the IASB got set up in London, in 2001, its first major standard was on employee stock options, which it called share-based payment. The opposition was much more diffused around the world for the IASB than it was in the United States. And the IASB succeeded in doing in 2004, when it finally got around to issuing its own standard, what the FASB tried and failed to do in early 1990s, that is to require, using an option pricing model, that the expense related to issuing employee stock options found its way into the income statement. But the opposition was strong in the U.S. to the FASB doing the very same kind of thing. An interesting development occurred. In 2002, this was in the wake of Enron and WorldCom, when the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed in July-August of that year. This was at a time, doesn't happen all that often, when there was a kind of glow around accounting, when it was in the front pages of the newspapers, not just in the financial section, about what was going on with those two collapsed companies. And there was a great concern that accounting has got to be done right. And there was this glow that lasts for maybe a period of 1 or 2 or 3 years until people begin to forget about this issue. And during this glow, Warren Buffett, who always felt very strongly about showing the expense related to employee stock options, being a board member of Coca-Cola and the Washington Post Company, persuaded both boards to begin showing its expense for stock options in their income statements. General Electric, possibly with some influence from Warren Buffett, who knew the chairman of the board of GE, followed suit. All of a sudden, it got picked up in the press. Big companies were beginning to show the expense from employee stock options in their income statement. It came to shareholder associations. It got on the agendas of a number of shareholder meetings by companies across the company. It began to be a movement, like dominoes falling. And by early 2004, some 800 American and Canadian companies had decided to take the expense out of the footnote required in the statement, in the opinion issued way back in 1995, and place it instead in the body of the income statement. And so much of this was begun by Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett was of the belief that employee stock options were an expense, and to him, expenses go into the income statement, not into footnotes. And so it was controversial when the issue was raised, despite the fact that hundreds of companies had, one might say voluntarily, but there was an awful lot of peer and societal pressure that went behind it, began locating their expense in the income statement. And so there was continued opposition from Silicon Valley and from other corporations. And at one point in the several stages of congressional interference, the House of Representatives approved legislation 312 to 111, that's almost 3-1, to prevent the board from acting, in effect telling the board they should not act on such an issue. And but leaders in the Senate supported the FASB and refused to bring the House action to the Senate. And here is where two people, members of the Senate, protected the FASB from going down in flames on this one. The chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, once the House bill is passed, it goes to the Senate Banking Committee for action in the Senate, was Richard Shelby. And the ranking member was Paul Sarbanes. They were both supporters of the SEC, of the FASB, and felt that standards should be set by an independent FASB and not by Congress. So when that legislation passed by the House of Representatives came to the Banking Committee, they killed it. They never had a hearing. They never considered it. It died in the Senate. And consequently, it was possible for something to happen. And the something to happen was that the board issued a standard that called for showing the expense in the income statement. Now, what Buffett was concerned about, and others were concerned, is that this bill that was passed, 312 to 111, said that if you do apply the FASB standard, it is limited only to the chief executive officer and the next highest paid executives in the company, 5. This was to protect Silicon Valley, where thousands of employees were covered. And so all but those 5 would not be covered by the standard. That was in the bill. This was the way to defeat the FASB. Another provision in the bill, which made absolutely no sense, which Warren Buffett, the well-known investor from Omaha, decried as mathematical lunacy, was to say that when you use the option pricing model, even for those 5 executives, you must assume that volatility is 0. That is to say that there are no fluctuations in the bond market. This reminded Buffett of what he had read about the Indiana House of Representatives way back in the 19th century, in 1997, where the Indiana House of Representatives passed legislation, which fortunately never came to light in terms of final legislation, unanimously, saying that pi, the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter, which is 3.14159, etc., shall hereforth in the state of Indiana be 3.2, rounded, to make it easier for farmers to make calculations. Buffett said, it sounds as ridiculous as the state of Indiana, and now the state of Indiana has moved east to Washington. That was the kind of thing you sometimes expect from members of Congress who know nothing about accounting, finance, or even economics, but pass legislation. Now, in a March 2009 congressional subcommittee hearing, which was stage managed clearly by the powerful American Bankers Association, several subcommittee members demanded that the FASB chair, Robert Hers, who was there before the subcommittee, arrange for the prompt issuance of softer guidelines on how to determine fair values in inactive markets when accounting for impairment losses on debt securities. And the board hurried to comply. They said, we want to see this in 3 weeks. Fortunately for the FASB, they were well along on issuing some pronouncements, and within the 3-week limit, they were able to issue this guidance to make it softer guidelines for banks to determine the fair values in inactive markets. Once again, the banking industry assaulting the FASB and assaulting the chairman verbally at that conference. And finally, in 2020, Congress twice passed legislation having nothing to do generally with accounting, but there was a provision in each of the two to postpone the effective date of the FASB's 2016 standard to replace the incurred loss model for held-to-maturity debt securities with what came to be called the current expected credit loss, CECL, called CECL, the current expected credit loss model, which requires the holder of the securities to estimate future losses over the remaining contractual life of the instrument. So in the past, what had been used was the historical incurred loss model, but it was believed that by the time the loss was occurred, it was too late to make a recognition. It was important that the accounting deal with the losses in prospect. As a result, the FASB got rid of the incurred loss model, and for held-to-maturity debt securities, it replaced it by the current expected credit loss model, which means you had to make an estimate for the remaining term of the life of the security because it is held to maturity. The middle-sized banks and credit unions said this is going to be very costly for them to implement, and they sued to try to get a postponement of the effective date. So the community of middle-sized banks and credit unions, complaining of the alleged procyclicality of the new standard and its impact on lending capacity, pressed Congress to enact the delays, which they did enact, because neither the FASB nor the SEC agreed to do so. So here we have the banks again, not the big banks this time, but the middle-sized banks and the credit unions, in this case not defeating the FASB, but postponing the effective date of the standard.